Does this look okay for you, or should I try to do something else?
I'm trying to make it as big as I can.
If you hit the little box next to the X, Rebecca, it should go full screen.
This is the wrong presentation.
Yep.
You have to go.
So it's in hers.
Beginning presentation, over on the left-hand side.
Yeah, I'm putting it on slideshow, which should mean you're just seeing the one slide, but that's not working.
That's all right.
Well, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Well, let me see here. More slideshow options. Select all slides. Well, I guess, yeah, I don't know. Okay, wait a minute. Display settings. No, that's not it. All right. Well, you can see the main slide.
Yep.
Okay. And now, did I hear someone say that I need to speak up?
Yes.
Yes.
I know, this is so fun. I wish I could be there, but I certainly understand. And this is nice that I can just do it from here. So I will try and speak up. And if for some reason I start fading, just interrupt me and I'll raise my voice. So I've actually had a couple of conversations with township staff and your township attorney. So I've been given the various versions of the ordinance that the Planning Commission has been working on over the last couple of years. I've had a conversation or a briefing, if you will, on kind of what you've gone through and where you are. And really my main objective when I first sort of started talking to the township was looking at your ordinances and doing your draft open space ordinance and doing a review of it and sort of giving you my comments as to, things I would do to it. And then after speaking to your staff, we had just a lovely conversation. And I think they felt, I know they felt as though if I could have a similar dialogue with both the township board and the planning commission, that would be kind of a great way to start before I actually gave you my review of the ordinance. And so that's what I wanted to do for you tonight. And then I just thought that if I put some of my ideas or things I wanted to sort of cover with you in a PowerPoint, that might be easier than me just standing in front of you talking. So that's what I'm going to do. Plus it kind of serves as the framework for what I want to talk about. So I know that you're familiar with open space preservation development. So I don't mean to be elementary about it, but in talking with staff, I understand what some of the questions have been, maybe not from the planning commission, but from the township, the residents or the township board members, or possibly the planning commission. And I thought that was a really good place to start because it sort of told me where it was you were coming from in terms of trying to work through this thing and get it moving forward. So I think the very first bullet is sort of what I was picking up on the most, was that there was just this overall concern that an open space preservation development was going to have the effect of encouraging growth, number one, and that number two, that whether or not the township wanted that growth was becoming a topic of debate. The rest of those bullet points, the remaining four, really are design elements of the open space preservation development approach in and of itself. Should we do a density bonus? Some concerns about metrics, right? The setbacks, concerns being expressed about, how sewer and water were going to be managed, the ability to use private roads as a development option. Those are more design related. I actually thought the bigger thing that piqued my interest was this sort of position or concern that was being expressed that an OSPD might not be an option that the township was interested in just because it may very well have the result of inspiring or encouraging growth. So I wanted to talk about that and then sort of segue into the actual specifics of your standards. So my second bullet here really responds to that original or that first bullet on concerns that were sort of coming out of these public meetings. And so I can't stress this enough. And you might feel totally grounded in this already. And so if you do, I apologize for repeating it, but I think it's key. An open space preservation development option does not introduce a new or a different or a higher density land use into the zoning district. It's simply saying, here is a different way that you can design the use that is already being allowed. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. It's not allowing denser development unless you go in and specifically allow an OSPD to be denser. And it is not creating a use option that isn't already allowed. You're simply saying in these districts where we're going to allow open space projects, what you're saying is that we actually think an open space development design is better. And we would, if you're going to go in there and do a residential subdivision, we would much rather have you do it under an OSPD design than under the traditional design. So it doesn't introduce a new or a higher density use. So that, in my opinion, is a key premise of everything after this, because it should really change the title of an OSPD option to, do we want this? Do we want to encourage growth? That kind of thing to, oh my gosh, this is absolutely the design approach we want to advocate. Big difference in going through this. Now, as you know, the Zoning Enabling Act was amended some years ago. And so now actually communities have to include an open space development option in their ordinance for any district where you have minimum lot sizes of a half acre or greater. So that is something that you are required to do. The reason I led off with the second bullet is that it's a good thing to offer it. Your position should be, this is our preferred approach. So the fact that the statute's requiring you to do it, that's just fine, because you're saying, you know what, we would do this whether it was required or not. So moving on, an open space development concept is considered to be, for all intents and purposes, a preferred design approach. Now, it is exactly that. It is a sort of a master planning or project planning approach or set of standards that a person going in who's going to divide the land, either platting it or dividing it under the Condominium Act and doing a site condominium, that they're going to do it under the dictates of this design approach. The OSPD approach itself does not actually divide the land. It simply provides the parameters for how you're going to design that project. But then the applicant, which then the township would also be part and parcel of that, no pun intended, would also be acting on whatever mechanism was going to be used to divide the land. So if you're approving an OSPD proposal, you would also be taking action on that that partnering, site condominium development or whatever mechanism they were going to use to do the land division. but the OSPD itself does not actually divide the land. Now, the last set of key ideas is that I don't know if you know this or even care about this, but actually the township has the ability to actually mandate open space OSPD approaches, design approaches, as opposed to just offering them as options. So here's this premise we're working with, right? The state, under the Zoning Enabling Act, they say, all right, in certain districts, you have to offer it as an option. Many communities go in there consistent with the act, and they offer it as an option. Many communities offer it as an option in that district as well as other residential districts. And some communities go in there and say, you know what? Because of the character of our particular community, maybe we have a lot of sensitive natural resources or, what have you. It's as important to us that we no longer want to see traditional subdivisions. We only want to see that level of density if they're doing it according to an OSPD. So you have the option of doing that. Now, if you are a community that says, no, that, we're not feeling quite that assertive about this. We want to make sure it's an option because we want to make sure we comply with the state law. But we're okay with offering it as an option. Then you get into this idea of, in my opinion, this is a real kind of a neat component of this is if you're a community that's saying, we recognize this as a preferred approach, we're just not going to mandate it. Then you start taking the position that we're going to do some cool things with it that really act as incentives for a person to come in and use it. And those incentives, and I know this gets back to one of your questions about the density bonus, which is well, for one thing, you don't have to do a density bonus. The only reason a community might do a density bonus is if they felt they needed something in there to incentivize the use of it. But that isn't necessary to do. You don't have to do that. And there are other things you can use to provide that incentive. In fact, and it's becoming truer now than it was even 10 years ago, one of the biggest design incentives that a community can use is to have an OSPD be the only form of development where you allow a private road. Now, that might be more possible or less possible now because road commissions themselves are starting to limit the number of public roads that they will accept. Some counties I work in, they won't even accept any new public roads. So people going in and platting or who are wanting to do residential developments are left with their only option being private roads. So if a community didn't allow private roads, they're essentially saying we are no longer allowing any development. But that notwithstanding, if you say in our community, the open space project design is the one place where we're going to allow private roads, that is probably one of the biggest incentives you can use. You would not need to introduce a density bonus because most developers would prefer to work with the less aggressive road design standards of private roads. And by less aggressive, I mean, public roads they are extremely land consumptive. They require large easements and, they don't allow cul-de-sacs and they do a bunch of things that if a person's going in and doing an OSPD, they're probably doing it because there are features of the land that they would like to preserve. And public roads almost make that impossible. So a private road option is a great incentive. And the other two areas of incentives that really work with applicants is if an OSPD approach in a community is extremely streamlined and has a very compact, workable schedule associated with it. Not that you're going to do less of a review, But if a developer or an applicant can look at your OSPD standards and say, you know what, I can go in there and do a traditional plat or even a site condominium development, and it's going to take me 6 months to get through the process, or I can do an OSPD and I can do it in 3 months. That is their incentive right there. So density bonuses are, although they are certainly an option, if in answer to the question, is that what we want to do? And if so, what should those be? I think you should start with sort of embracing the idea that, maybe we do them, but let's talk about whether or not we want to, and maybe there are some other incentives that we can do. So to me, I wanted to start this whole conversation out with telling you, here's kind of what I was understanding to be some of the key topics that continued to sort of surface as you guys were talking about this. And then I wanted to throw out just my opinion of what makes, why this conversation about an OSPD sort of answers some of those main concerns. And really, it allows you to next move into this conversation about, what's a great way to do it then. And that you can move beyond the question of should we do it, but rather what's the best way to do it. So I wanted to just talk about, I keep talking to you about why I think and why OSPDs are sort of talked about as being the preferred design. So first of all, they're considered to have a lot of benefits to them. This is just this list here is out of a lot of literature on conservation subdivision design, which is the same thing as an OSPD design. And so there are probably a list of things that you've already read and maybe you already sort of embrace those. But the one thing I wanted to point out from this list to you is what you'll notice about it is that many of them are benefits to the applicant. This gets back to this idea of incentives, right? If you're if you're allowing the same density on a piece of property, and you're allowing that density on only half the property in exchange for preservation of the other half, then you've automatically allowed for compact development, which is cheaper for a developer to do in terms of earthwork, in terms of utilities, in terms of roads. So all of those things are benefits to developers. So you'll go through that list and you'll say, that's interesting. A lot of these things I can see if I were a developer or an applicant, property owner, but these would be reasons why I might consider an OSPD a preferred design. The other ones are very much community benefits. And so, as well as I do, I mean, you guys are seasoned PC members, you know how that goes when you get land use design options where both the community considers them to be good, maybe for different reasons, and the developer considers them to be preferred. Those are always the scenarios that you're striving for. And I would suggest that OSPD is in that category, and these are the reasons why. The second reason an OSPD is a preferred design, and I can't stress this enough, and I'm just going to go through this only because I think it is super cool. I love when messages are explained visually because I think it really helps hit it home. And to me, the reason an OSPD design is a preferred design is because the way you go about getting the design is preferred, which means you get a better design at the end as opposed to a traditional development. So once again, I'll stress or I'll repeat myself that you're not saying, oh, we're going to now allow an OSPD and so we're opening this land up to development. No, you're not doing that. What you're saying is that we understand as currently zoned and under our current zoning ordinance the property owner developer could go in on this piece of property and do a traditional subdivision at density X. And what we are offering is an option for you to go in there to do a residential development at density X, but with a better design. And in exchange for that better design, you know, we'll allow you to do some things differently. Like we'll give you a faster review period or something to that effect. So the design process, in my opinion, is just superior, and it goes like this. And if you've seen this before, then it will serve as a reminder or a refresher course. If you haven't seen it, you'll know what I'm talking about at the end. So here's an example of a piece of property that starts out before development. And this might be how you see a piece of property that comes into you that a developer is going to come into. And what you ask for them, and your draft ordinances have this requirement. And to me, it is the absolute best way to require an establishment of the density that property is going to be allowed to design around. So what you ask for is this particular schematic refers to it as a yield plan. Your ordinance calls it something else. Sometimes you'll hear it called as a parallel plat plan, but the whole idea is that they go in, they take the piece of property and they say, if I were going to plat this property using your current subdivision control ordinance standards, here is a design that I could do. Because you'll notice that some of the property they can't develop. In this example, because of the river, the creek, and the slopes associated with those creek in terms of soil types and grades, there are certain portions of this property that are not developable. And as you know, if they were putting together a preliminary plat design, they wouldn't be able to develop those. So they have to exclude those in a yield plan. But essentially what this plan is saying is that, all right, I've taken out those lands that I know are not developable under your ordinance, and I've put in there a road per the design of the, the agency having jurisdiction. So if it's a public road requirement, here my road meets your road commission standards. And based on the district that I'm in, I understand what my minimum lot size standards are and my frontage standards. And if I apply all of those standards, this is this is a preliminary plat design that I actually could take through the process and get approved. So that represents their yield plan or their parallel plat plan, whereby the density allowed for that project site has just been established. And I think this is 32, but it doesn't matter, whatever that number is. If the number is 30 lots, then they have just now determined for their proposal and for your review that they are authorized to develop that land under current zoning without any variations, variances, or bonuses. They're allowed to create 30 building sites. And that's the step one where they create this yield plan. Then here's the design process you want to see them do. That they take the property and they go through this step process where they say, all right, here's the property, and I'm going to first identify primary conservation areas. And I can guarantee you this is almost identically opposite from what a developer will do or an engineer will do when they go in to lay out a traditional subdivision. So you're saying first, you take out any properties that they refer to them as primary conservation areas, but these are those same areas that they simply can't develop, right? They're either underwater or they're too steep. So they're conservation areas, no doubt, but it's not because they're offering them, it's because they can't develop them. But then you're asking for them to do a second level of conservation sort of inventory or perspective, where they go in there and they say, okay, now these are not undevelopable, but what they represent are things on this particular property that are worth preserving, that they're developable. If we wanted to go in there and do a plat, there is no state law, there is no local reg that would not allow us to develop these. We could remove the historic building, we could clear cut the trees, we could do these various things. But we're looking at it from a perspective of, what's worth preserving, what has value to preserving. And so you go through there and you get to be a little cool with your thought process and say, you know what, it's an old historic building I want to preserve. Here are some woodlands that add value. We think there's value in the view from the abutting roadway. We want to preserve that. We don't want to develop right up to the road. We think there's value in some of the view sheds from this property, so we don't want to eliminate those. Blah blah blah. Right? You go through and you identify these secondary conservation areas. And when you add those two together, the primary and the secondary, then what you have left are your development areas. So essentially, instead of going through there and saying, how many lots can I get by virtue of extending the road and using up all the property, you're saying, no, I already know how many I'm allowed to have. I'm allowed to have 30. I already figured that out with my parallel plan. Now I want to go through there and see what are the ideal properties in which to locate those 30 homes. And you do so by removing the things you want to preserve. And then what you're left with are development areas. So that step 3 essentially is identifying your development areas. Then you go in, I'm talking about the developer and their designer now, that they go in and they say, now I'm going to locate the homes based on the aspects of the property, not based on arbitrary metrics of, I know I have to have X feet of frontage. I know I have to have X minimum square footage on my lot. And why don't you have to do that? Because lot size standards and lot frontage standards are intended, the reason a community has those is to establish the density that is going to be allowed for a piece of property. You've already done that. You've said you may have 30 lots on this, because if you went in and platted it, you could have 30 lots. So you've removed the need to have any of these metrics. And instead, the developer can go in and say, great, I'm going to locate homes where I know they are valuable, right? They have valuable view sheds, or they are easily serviceable. I don't have to do a lot of grading. I don't have to do a lot of filling, because they do that so they can get the number of sites they need so that they can make a profit at developing the land. If they're not having to do that and they can still get their 30 lots, then there's no reason for them to place homes where they have to do all of that modification to the property. They would prefer not to. So in that respect, they're going in here and they're being allowed, if you will, to locate the homes in places that are better suited from a land standpoint, and most probably are better suited from an economic standpoint. I mean, they have more value to them. So then once they've located their homes, then they go in and they say, oh, okay, if I know these are the areas in which I will be developing, and here are my prime building placement locations, then what does my road network have to look like to serve them? You can see that this is totally different than if you were doing a traditional subdivision, because you're not doing the road first and then putting homes based on dimensional requirements. You're letting the land guide where they should be. And as the very last as the very last step, I'm sorry, you go in and based on the home placement and the road placement, you then identify the appropriate location for the lot lines. That's the last step. So in the end, then you have a development that has clustered homes, has the areas that have been identified as worth preserving, preserved, and you have a road system that serves homes that have been placed according to the advantages of the property. So the difference in the designs are shown here in these aerials, where on the right is your typical subdivision design that is, let's say that I'm throwing around this 30 unit density. So on your left, it would be those same 30 sites. Now you can see, I'm going to take this opportunity to point out a few things that are, I mean, obviously the biggest visual impact is for this traditional subdivision design. Obviously they're using every piece of the property with the exception of this creek bed because they couldn't, because the slopes and the soils. And I suppose someone could say, well, if it's still 30 homes, it's not like they're covering all of that. And that is true. But what happens when you have this right here is considered a value, right? A creek bed, that would be considered an asset to a piece of property. We saw from the conservation areas that there were portions of this that had really good view sheds and some woodlands over here. And then in addition to that, this is the abutting roadway. And most rural communities, when they talk about the character of their community, what they're really talking about is, most of us define the character of our community by what we see when we travel down the road. So how close that development is to the road and what part of the land cover that can be retained helps dictate what that character is. So you'll notice that in a design such as this, even though it's still 30 homes, they have essentially eliminated the ability to be responsive to any of those objectives. Now the only people who are experiencing the value of this creek are these homes along in here. So there might be 6 of them that are experiencing the value of this asset. There's a couple of the homes here because they're in their backyards. So no one else can access them and no one else can enjoy them. So there is no value to the rest of the property owners here of this asset. In addition to that, if the community is saying, look, we like the fact that this foreground is preserved because it helps maintain the character of our roadway. That's not the case here because that's their side yard. They could have an accessory building here. They could, even if you have setbacks and buffers, it's not the same as being able to preserve it as part of the development open space. So this kind of a design, not only do we talk about all the benefits to the applicant or to the developer, right, in terms of compact development, and not only does the community look at it and say, yeah, look at this 50% open space we're preserving, but there's more meaning to it than that. It's the open space is meaningful open space. Now, everyone in this community is able to experience the value of this water asset and the woodland asset and the woodlands here and the view sheds and the open space, which means it plays into the value of all of their property because this is not someone's backyard now or side yard. It's accessible to all of them because all of this open space is owned by all of them. So that process in and of itself allows for a much better exercise of the sort of the design objectives. It allows for a better way of dealing with the land and coming up with a design. So not only are there benefits in the design, but the process itself allows for that. And again, better designs. I'm not going to go through the details of all of these, but I have a couple of sort of cut sheets here that essentially the point of them, because I forwarded this PowerPoint to Carol, so it's at your disposal as well. But I think the sort of the takeaways from these are that they use different project site sizes You know, it doesn't have to be a certain size property to work for an open space project. They use different amounts of land that are being preserved. Sometimes it's 50%, sometimes it's 70%. So it works for a lot of different things. It works for different density standards, but it gives you a good idea of sort of how that sort of transcends all the different underlying things you're trying to accomplish. So this is a 33 acre project site, and they have 36 lots on it with a 53% open space. So that's one scenario. Here's another one where this is just a 12, not 12 acre. What's the total land area here? 58 acres total. So what was that other one? Oh, that was a 70 acres total. I misspoke. I said 33. 70 acres total. This is a 58 acre total with 72 lots. See, but they had a different density standard in the underlying, or not underlying, but the district that it's in allows for platting at higher densities. So it gave them a higher number of lots that they could create. But look at all that they were able to achieve through clustering. This is a 63 acre. Now this had quite on the high end of the conservation land at 63%, but sometimes that works for the development. If they're going for that level of density, then that amount of preservation works for them as long as they can have the number of lots they need. And then here is a 46 acre project site with 30,000 square foot lots, essentially, 18 lots. So it just gives you, I think they're cut sheets that really let you sort of expand that actual process that we just went through for that site to see how it would look in a lot of different scenarios. Here are a couple of slides that are facts from an actual case study over the village of Caledonia over here in the Grand Rapids area. But the project site itself is, okay, I guess it doesn't. I guess what I was trying to do was sort of draw some equations. So they are a community that has some suburban element to it, but some rural, but they do have a lot of productive farmland. But in this, they are experiencing a lot of development pressures, and they are experiencing pressure for high density, municipal sewer and water. And of course, they don't want that into their rural zoning. So I thought there were some common elements here. So as they were looking at how to respond to the development pressure, they, foremost in their mind was, we don't want to lose our farmland. And that's added to, I think, the more common objectives for communities, which is, the preservation of their rural character and their open space. I'm going to introduce into here, not that they were experiencing that then, but a lot of places in Michigan, this may not necessarily be for Sylvan, but this has become even more of interest because with the housing shortage, there has been renewed interest in housing development. And so communities that were not getting that pressure before might be being looked at right now. So for rural communities who are sort of blanching at the idea of what that kind of platting pressure means to their community, the OSPD option offers them that way to say, sure, you can go ahead and develop at that density, but you're going to have to do it in a way that works for us, which is this preservation design approach. So in this particular development, it's the Oldfield Settlement, they had a 65 acre, and this is obviously an extremely low density development, but the design elements to me, are the salient points here. So it's a 65 acre project site with the idea of putting 15 houses on it. And they were able to do that by submitting their parallel plat plan or their yield plan or whatever you wanted to call it. And under their plat, because the particular zoning of the property they had very high minimum lot sizes. So you can see that in order for them to plat this, this was the density they were able to achieve with those lot size standards under the subdivision control ordinance. Under their OSPD design approach, they established their density here. Then they applied it here, right? There are no minimum lot size standards or frontage standards, but they go in and they establish the densities. You can see you're getting 2 clusters there. All of them have access to and experience the value of the adjacent creek. You can see all of this land, the roadside protection that is offered for that, and the minimal amount of, or I should say not minimal, but the reduced amount of road that is needed to be built. So they were able to protect their abutting roadway because they preserved the tree line. This is actually in that area, not only from a plat, but from unplatted, because sometimes, although unplatted land certainly is lower density, sometimes it can have it can be more impactful on some of the things that are important to you. If your corridor is important to you, the unplatted land, they're drawing property lines every 100 feet or every 200 feet, and that really changes the character of the roadside sometimes. And then in this particular settlement, of the about 42 acres that they were preserved, they used them for a number of things, but I thought I liked including this because this is the kind of thing, remember I talked about, it adds value to all of the lots, not just the ones that happen to have it as part of their backyard. But if you're in a lot that abuts, all of the lots are going to be abutting all of the open space because you're requiring open space networks, right? They have to be adjacent. Then the value for these homes is that they back up to these open space areas that are accessible to them. In addition, from the community standpoint, they're being preserved. Now they left their open space in their woodlands, and then they used them for walking trails and for landscaped opportunities, wildflowers and that kind of thing. But here's where I would also sort of sprinkle in the idea. I've worked for a lot of communities where they use their OSPD option as a sort of tool by which to get a lot of these different kinds of OSPD developments where the open space takes on a lot of different forms. Sometimes they're used as farmland preservation techniques because it's preserved open space. And the fact that it continues to be used for farming in some communities, if you were a farmland community, you would consider that and obviously a primary preservation objective. I've also worked in communities where they use them for, I reviewed an open space project where part of the open space, it wasn't all of it, but part of the open space was their private airfields, because everyone who lived in that community had owned private airplanes. And so they had hangars as part of their project, and the airfields were part of the open space. They all faced it. They all had buildings that fronted it. And it was quite interesting. They would not have been able to do that with the traditional subdivision approach. Now, I'm going to segue now on these last 2 slides. I wanted to segue into just some comments that I have on the review of your ordinance. Now, I know you've had a couple of different versions of it, but I thought this was a good opportunity for me to tell you, because some of these things are in your draft ordinance and some are not. So things that when I look at an open space development ordinance, the things that I think are important and things that I think make it easier and easier to use and better to apply from a community standpoint. Now, I normally don't have a preference between doing something as an allowed use versus an overlay district. But in my opinion, with an OSPD, I think you will find it easier to use if you don't try to do it through an overlay district. I know the text that you have in front of you or have had in front of you is using that approach. If you asked for me, for my opinion about it, I think you would be happier with simply going through the districts where you want, where you have to have an open space as an option, and you may have other districts you want to allow it in, but wherever you're going to do it is to simply identify it as either a permitted use or a special land use, depending on what kind of review process you want to apply. And I think you will find it far more streamlined and easier to use. That would be one observation I would make. You definitely want a parallel plat requirement or yield plan requirement in there. Your draft ordinance does speak to that. I know one version of it allowed a couple of different ways to establish that density that was going to be allowed. I believe the very last version simply uses the parallel plat requirement, and it would be my suggestion that you only that you establish the one approach and that it be this yield plan or parallel plat standard that you use. You do not want to have lot size or lot width standards in there. When they go in to establish the parallel plan or the yield plan, that parallel plan has to use the lot size and lot width standards that apply in the district in which the property is located. So it is being used as the way to create your density standard, essentially. But when it goes to then using that density standard to create your OSPD design, you do not want arbitrary metrics dictating those kinds of things, because, you know, again, the purpose of a lot size, lot width standard is density management. You're already doing that. So you're taking away one of the things that makes this a good design option by if you add those standards in. I saw one of the versions have them and one not. So I would definitely, that would definitely be an observation of mine, is that you don't want them. In addition to that, a way to keep it not only simple, but rational, right? You want to be able to argue that you are treating this similarly, is that the dimensional requirements of the district apply. So if in the, you know, if in District X, the setback requirement is 25 feet from the road, then it's going to be 25 feet from the road in the open space project. There's no reason to treat that differently. If they've gone through and identified the density, and then if they've gone through the design process whereby they've said, here are our conservation areas, and here's our development area, blah, 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 according to that process, then the setbacks of the district are, or any other metric, right? Lot coverage, building height, all of the metrics of the district should apply just as they would anywhere else. You don't need to repeat them. You don't need greater standards. You don't need different standards. In my opinion too, and I didn't see this in your, I think I saw it in one version, not another. So it's very possible that some of the observations I'm making were sort of already made in some form or another as you went through your drafts. But in my opinion, you do not want, you certainly don't need, but I would even suggest you don't want a minimum project size. I think communities, this is my experience, I'm making editorial remarks, so I hope you can sift through these when I'm making an editorial remark, but I know how it is when communities sort of, you know, venture forward with a development approach or a design standard or something that is new to them. Their inclination is to be, and there's nothing wrong with that, their inclination is to be sort of very conservative in it. And I sort of look at project size limitations as a community's way of sort of putting on the brakes to full use of it. It's like they want to offer it as a design option, but they're terrified that someone's going to use it. So they put a project size on it because they say, well, this way we can sort of feel more comfortable that someone isn't going to come in and propose this in a place we don't want it. And so if you put a project size of, oh, you have to be at least 20 acres in size. Oh, good. We take it, we eliminate, people coming in and trying to put it where it shouldn't go. Well, I mean, in my opinion, an OSPD design approach is a preferred approach. Repeat. It's a preferred approach. They can go in there with any property size they want and propose a traditional subdivision. So putting a project size on an OSPD is simply one more roadblock you're putting, whereby you're actually telling someone, we would actually prefer you do a traditional subdivision. That's essentially what you're saying, because they can take a 5-acre piece of land and plat it if they want to. I mean, they're subject to your standards, but I would look at it and say, if you're going to take a piece of property, if you're bound and determined to develop this piece of property with more than one dwelling unit, I would much rather have you do it using my OSPD design, because it will create a better design. So you shouldn't care what project size is. If you believe it's a preferred design and you are comfortable and support the standards you have in your OSPD design provision, then you would want that to be used anywhere where you allow it, no matter what the project size is. Private roads. If I read your ordinance correctly, and so you might be able to correct me on this, but I thought I read where you do not allow for the establishment of new, you might have existing private roads, but where you're not allowing new private roads. If I'm correct in that, if that's true, then I would say you are in a really great position to use private roads as an incentive. Obviously, that's not an incentive option or opportunity in a community that allows private roads anywhere, right? You kind of remove that as an option. That's what this means, by the way. That is a capital I for incentive. So that is something that if you are interested in sort of incentivizing, if you get comfortable with OSPDs as a preferred approach, and you're interested in keeping them optional, not mandating them, but incentivizing them, especially if I'm sort of sensing that density bonuses sort of are a sensitive topic, allowing private roads is a great way to do it. And I would suggest, even if you didn't see them as necessarily an incentive, I would suggest that given the differences in design standards, I'm not talking about construction standards. So I'm not talking about roads that degrade or don't have the appropriate drainage. That's construction standards. You want private road construction standards to be just as good as public. But from a design perspective, you can allow private road designs that are so much more appropriate for preservation-based residential development than you can a public road and a traditional subdivision. Public roads are, the design standards for public roads play a huge role in the land consumptive designs that you get in traditional subdivisions. So if you feel so inclined, I would suggest to you, incentive or not, allowing private roads in OSPDs mean that you are increasing the opportunity to get better and more preservation-minded residential development design, because you're not requiring so much of the land to be eaten up by right of way and by road designs that don't allow for certain configurations. And then this is my last set of comments. I would also, it seems to me like I read in your minutes. So if I'm touching on something that maybe has not been an issue, I apologize. But I thought I picked up on some conversation where there was concern about what the open space should be allowed to be used for. And my only reaction to that is, and I think I've seen this in your draft text and I support it, is don't, for one thing, don't eliminate the use of open space as ag land. You don't know if that may be, geez, if they're in an area that's prime farmland, you would want to be able to let the open space to be continued to be used for farming. That would not necessarily be considered a non-preservation based use of land. And it's also it's also considered open space. So the only thing there I would say is to not be too narrow in your view of what open space can be used. The designated open space can be used for, that open space that counts toward the 50%, I mean. Not to be too narrow in your view of that, but, and you have this provision in there, to absolutely rely heavily on your provision that essentially says, here's what it can be, here are all the different things it can be used for, but you have to show us what you're proposing to use it for. And once we approve it, then that's what you can use it for, and that's it. And to me, that's a much better way of doing it. Fewer metric requirements. I hit on this already, not just with the land, lot size and lot frontage standards, which you don't need, but in simply using those that apply within the district, so that developments are, you're looking at building form and building patterns similar in terms of setbacks and that kind of thing. But more importantly than that, the whole purpose of an OSPD design process is to allow a developer or applicant to let the features and assets of the land dictate the design. And the more metrics you put in there, the less able they're to do that. And by that, I mean arbitrary metrics, right? So if you use that design process, then you don't get tripped up by that. The design process I went through, you can actually mandate that if you want to. You don't have to, but I've seen some ordinances that say, I mean, because it's a recommended design process, right? It's conservation subdivision design 101, if you will. And so your ordinance doesn't have to say, we want you to go through that process, but you can if you want, or some version of it. You definitely want the yield plan or parallel plat plan requirement. But if you want them on their final plan to show you, on the site plan, look, we want to see your primary, we want to see your secondary and your development. We want to see that on your product, how you essentially arrived at your development areas and your design. That certainly can be part of your process. And then lastly, and I actually think your latest version of your ordinance, I thought did a decent job of this. I would have to study it more closely, which I will, as I present you with my review of it, but more just abstractly, I would say that communities, and this is not some big revelation on my part. You may already embrace this just as part of your day-to-day operations, but what communities have learned over the last 20 years is that one of the most advantageous and beneficial things that they can offer an applicant is a process that is fair and predictable, which means it is something that an applicant can read your ordinance. They can say, I know exactly what they're going to ask for. I know exactly what they're going to do when they look at this. And I'm going to appear before them one time and I'm going to have my answer because I already know they're already telling me what they're looking for. And if they can have a process whereby everything is clear, that reviews where possible, they can be administrative. I see one thing I really liked in this last version is the yield plan, or that parallel plat plan, was being proposed to be able to be reviewed administratively. I thought that was a great way to feed into that last bullet. Anything that makes it fair, predictable, easy, and in a very timely way. And I'm not talking about that they skip reviews or that somehow one process gets greater attention than another, but that the process itself is set up to be timely so that an applicant looks at it and you can actually point to it as one of your incentives for picking an OSPD. So I'm telling you right now, if an applicant, you'll notice in here, I've said nothing about density bonuses in these two slides, which are the can you, I got out of that, didn't I? Okay, there we go. That if an applicant is looking, they've got a piece of property and no applicant goes into it saying, I'm really looking to do an OSPD. So I'm looking for the right property to do that on. Mostly they're not doing that. What they're doing is they're saying, I want to do a residential development. They probably already have the property in mind because they have it for other reasons. But what they're looking to do is a lot of developers are looking to say, they're looking to the community and saying, here's what I want to do. What is it that you want me to do? How do you want me to do it? Because I'm happy to do it that way if it fits what I'm trying to do. And that's where the township can then step in and say, there you go. If we actually do have a process that probably would be a preferred design for you, it's certainly a preferred design for us. And here are the things that from your side of the table would probably be considered advantageous to you. It's a development approach where you can use private road. You're not subject to lot size and arbitrary lot size. I shouldn't say arbitrary because lot size and frontage standards are not arbitrary. They are designed to achieve a particular density, but they become arbitrary if you apply them in an open space design standard design. And we have an extremely streamlined process. The applicant would look at those things alone and say, those are advantages to me to do an OSPD over a traditional subdivision design. And when I say traditional subdivision design, I'm not saying that they're platting it versus using site condo. I'm just saying the design itself is your traditional design of pretty much using 100% of the land with a public road. And it's just a land consumptive design. Whether you divide the land through platting or through site condo, it doesn't matter because you can do them at the same time. So I would say, in summary, I would say that that the things that maybe, if I sort of understood correctly, that were tripping up sort of movement forward on this OSPD approach need not be reasons to trip you up. And instead, the OSPD process should be things that excite the township as a way of responding to either development pressure or the very real, threat of loss of rural character. You can say, my gosh, we have an answer to that that does not take away a person's development opportunity. So we cannot be charged with a takings. And it allows for the same development that they can do right now if we don't do anything, but with a much better design. So instead of being, an obstacle, I think you have in front of you something that you can and should embrace. And then I just wanted you to feel comfortable with why that is. And then to give you a feel too for what an ordinance should look like. And I would say that the last version that I shouldn't say the last version I read, the last version that you have that was, I think it was prepared by your attorney and maybe reviewed and some thoughts provided on it, essentially. I think it has some very positive elements to it. There are some things in it I would change if it were me drafting the ordinance. There were some things that would be changed. And I'm going to make this last comment. And I can because I know Rob. And that is, I have written a lot of OSPDs and I read a lot of them and I've applied a lot of them. And you know what? There are easier ways to say things than the way that particular ordinance is sort of constructed. So for as much as I think it has the right principles in it and the right standards in it, I would suggest that there are easier ways to say that, which might go a long way toward making it seem like not such a cumbersome design option, or not such a scary one, one that has things about it that are, maybe pose concerns to you. So I think you have a draft in front of you, or your last draft anyway, that has some really neat things about it and some important things about it that are good. And maybe it's just a matter of making some minor modifications and maybe rewording some things. So now that concludes what I wanted to say to you. I realized what I was initially retained for was to essentially perform the review and to provide you with that review of the text. And then if you wanted me to proceed on with, preparing draft text, that would be, that would be decided then. But I think this actually opportunity to have this conversation, it has merit as well. And so as far as I'm concerned, if you guys have things you want to ask me or talk about, or, that this is a good time to do that.
Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate it. And, there was a lot there, but I thank the township board for engaging with you, because I think it's exactly what we needed to do, was sort of step back with our focus. And so I'll just give you my thoughts right off the bat. I think we drafted one ordinance, we sent it up, it came back to the board with changes, we drafted another one, it got stuck. And I think it all came down to, some of it is a misunderstanding of what it is we're trying to do as a township. And what I liked about what you framed was, and I remember this back in the early 2000s, that we're in a legislature when they were talking about OSPDO and all this stuff and what we do. I said, it's the worst name they could have come up with, is open space preservation development option, because it has a lot of horrible words in it that conjure up things for different people. The word development is what this township got stuck on, which was, would this allow people to do these huge developments on big pieces of property? And I think we probably would have been better served to just name it a design process, a rural preservation design process. And I think that's how I kind of look at this is, and I'll take an example that we didn't do OSPDO. We had a very controversial project come before us a few years ago where someone wanted to do 8 homes, and of course, those that don't want in their backyard said it was 80. But the problem with the process is they had to start by a zoning change, right? Because you took the piece of property, you looked at it, you said 2-acre ag lots, it doesn't configure right for me to get 8 homes, which is what I need to get for the financial viability of the project. So I come to you with a zoning change, and it wasn't even conditional. It was just zoning, which means we can't even look at it from what you want to do. We just have to look at it and say, would 1-acre lots on this 100 and some acres a good idea? Well, then the public comes in and gets scared that there's gonna be 80 homes, and there could be 80 homes, or if we do it here, it's gonna happen everywhere. And I don't think that's not without merit, right? I think the problem was, what's the design process we want? And the way I look at OSBDO is that it's obvious this township does not want huge development in all areas. We already have it in some of our court-appointed areas. But if we are gonna allow development, is it about preserving land? And if we do that, then is it always a zoning change that you have to do? And that's why OSBDO is advantageous to me. Because you can look at it and say, the density is the same. It doesn't matter whether we're doing this under ag or low density residential, this development would be X no matter what. But if we went back and redesigned it, could we preserve more of the land as part of the process? Or more importantly, to what I hear from people when they testify in this body, they don't see a bunch of homes when they drive down the road. They don't want to look out their backyard and see Westchester Farms. They don't, it's about sight lines. It's a lot of the things you talked about. And that's why I think the design process would be advantageous if we just took the 100-pound gorilla of density off the table and really just start to focus on the design process. So I love what you said. I think there's a lot that could be done even with the current version that the board has, if the board wants to start there, or however she does her review. From what I heard from the planning commission meetings, and we had, how many of those?
Oh.
It was all about,
I think there were, I'm
yeah,
gonna guess off the top of my head, something like 12 or 15.
yeah, a lot of
over
meetings.
A long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, it was, first of all, and some of us expressed that, right? We're nervous about having huge developments before we wouldn't. And I think you shine a new light on what you could incentivize, which is things like the private road, because that's the sticking point in this township right now, right? Like, there are no public roads in Washoe County going in. We don't have private roads, that we're pretty much stuck. And I think that's where these developers come in and say, well, I'm just gonna do it here because I have this much land that I can do it. So I think there's some important points for us to consider if it comes back to us and we have to look at it. And I don't know, those are my thoughts. I don't know, other members from what you heard, similar and different.
I think we should be open for everything, listen to it, see how it lays out and stuff like that.
Yeah, the private road thing is strange, you gotta figure out how you develop that. The other incentive being some sort of quicker process. I was curious, you mentioned, we did ours as an overlay district, and you suggested that you would not. And you said something about limiting it to certain zonings or being able to be better about that. Now, the overlay district that we did was only allowed on certain, we could say which ones we allowed it in. So what's the difference? Why would we not use the overlay?
Well, so procedurally, an overlay district means you're going to have to go in and rezone. So now it's true that you might be looking at it saying, no, we've already assessed our township and we already know we want these 10 properties. And so we're going to rezone all of them at once, but you're never going to apply it to at all potential development sites. So you're always going to have the option of someone coming in wanting it on property where it's not zoned that way. And so you've just introduced 3 months at best, possibly 4 months into their process. So you've just removed one of your incentives, number one. Number two, overlay zones, I love overlay zones. To me, they are a solution to so many things. But they're usually used in an area where, not in an area, they're usually used to allow a particular thing across a host of different zones and properties. So, you'll often see overlay zones around water features, right? Where they're saying, we're going to have an overlay zone for this waterfront setback because we can't just put it in the district because there's 5 different districts around the eye. An open space development option, anywhere where you are going to allow, which you do, any of your residential districts allow residential subdivisions. Now, they allow them at different densities, but they are allowed to develop a subdivision. Wherever they're allowed to do a subdivision, your automatic position should be, we would prefer that you do an OSPD to a traditional design. That's what we would prefer. So that's going to be all property in every district. So if you take your overlay district and apply it to some properties in a couple of your rural districts, what about the rest of the property? And if you're just going to add it to properties as they come before you, then it's possible that the whole thing could be rezoned to overlay anyway. Well, so then why not just have it, if you have it as a, even if you felt a little nervous by saying, we don't want to allow it by right, but we would prefer to do a special land use, even that's better than, in my opinion, than in putting it through the rezoning process and adding that time, especially when I don't know on what basis you would ever deny a rezoning to the overlay district. Because they can go in and develop it as a traditional.
Mhm.
So why would you be saying no to the overlay?
Yeah, it's sticky. I agree. Yeah. Kurt, I know you at the beginning said you had some
Yeah.
questions.
I just, looking at the ordinance as it's been proposed, I'm not in favor of the bonus density at all. To me, it's sort of counterintuitive to create a bonus to cram people in even tighter. I think it defeats the purpose of preserving open space. I like the idea of having private roads as part of this. I think that makes a lot of sense for the township. And I think the process was, we, the board, had some questions, some concerns, and we didn't want to just make a couple tweaks to the version you gave us. There were a lot of tweaks we needed to make, and at that point, we substantially changed what you handed to us.
Right.
So at that point, legal advice was, no, you got to give it back to you guys.
Yeah. Yeah, you're
Because
right.
we're starting to make too many changes to it.
Yep, that was the process. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all I had. That was a good presentation. I've seen that. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I like sort of zooming back. I think the density was an issue. Because even what we approved, it wasn't much of a vote. Like, as a developer, I never saw that being a huge incentive, unless you're doing those huge projects. And so, but there are other sticking points that she pointed out, and I didn't think about private roads in that way, but I kind of agree. I'm interested in exploring that. 1 second, I just want to make sure.
I would like to just, Rebecca, you talked a lot about the private roads, and we do not have a private road ordinance. How do we balance not having a private road ordinance now with this OSPD ordinance? Does this get put aside until we get our private road ordinance written? Or can we go ahead and approve the OSPD now?
Yeah, and to expand upon that, that's a great point on is, I was thinking that when you were talking, I was thinking, okay, if you allow private roads, then what structure do you put around the private road? You said construction standards would be the same, you almost would have to write a mini private road section, right? How's that done?
Yeah, so I've seen communities do it both ways. For communities that do not allow private roads anywhere else, they simply have a section in the OSPD that would apply to private roads. And it's a section of standards that are on the road design, right? Other communities, if they have a private road ordinance already, then they'll simply have a provision in there that says, you know, it can either be public or private road. So I would say that if you're a community that doesn't envision, obviously you don't have a private road ordinance, and if you don't envision, at least in the near future, wanting to allow them outside of an OSPD, it would seem to be more practical to just have those road standards right in the OSPD ordinance, and they don't have to be extensive.
But if we do that, how do we handle other requests for private roads? Could there be other requests for private roads that would not be in an OSPD situation? Do we find ourselves in conflict then? We have it buried in one ordinance, but we don't have a standalone ordinance that addresses private roads.
Right, because you are under, that's a great question. The township is under no obligation to allow private roads. But if the township has said, we feel that if you do so in a OSPD design arrangement, that the negative impacts of the private roads are addressed, et cetera, you can have standards for an OSPD that you do not have to apply elsewhere. So the answer to it would be, right? So if someone comes in and says, I'd like to use a private road, but just not in an OSPD, then the township says, well, you can't. If you want to use a private road, then you're going to have to use this design mechanism.
The planning commission spent a great deal of time trying to write a private road ordinance. Let me just clarify this. We have an ordinance that addresses private roads. And what it says is that from however long ago it was, the township would not consider private roads in any way. That's what our ordinance says. We do have an ordinance. It simply says we will not have private roads. We need to come up with an ordinance that will allow private roads. If we do it if we have a section just in the OSPD ordinance and don't have a standalone private ordinance, can we default to the county road building standards and make it so simple that we say in the open space preservation, you may have a private road, it must be built to county standards. Can it be as simple as that?
Yes. I would vary from that slightly. And yes, I'm familiar with your private road ordinance. I did read that. So by virtue of allowing it in the OSPD, you're saying that here's where it's allowed and nowhere else. From a construction standards standpoint, yes, your OSPD street standard can be that it's subject to the construction standards of the County Road Commission. However, you would then add to that different design standards. So you wouldn't require the same width of right-of-way, or you wouldn't require the same width of pavement, or you wouldn't, you can distinguish that, but because the Road Commission standards go into length in terms of, how deep of a gravel base and there's no reason to repeat any of those or to make your own. So I agree with you. You could simply say they have to be constructed to the county standards, but here are design standards that you can use in terms of right-of-way width and pavement width, and because you don't need a 66-foot wide right-of-way in a low density preservation based development.
At the same time, we don't want a single lane roadway, which we dealt with in another project. It is a private road that currently exists in Sylvan Township, but it's only about 15 foot wide. That was the one that was going to be near the daycare center. And so I don't know that the township, wants it so narrow that it's not functional.
Right, you'd set up whatever standards that you feel are appropriate, are good minimum standards.
Do those then go into our development standards that we already have? Is that where those would be written, or again, are they just strictly in the OSPD ordinance?
The OS,
What you just spoke to.
yeah, they'd be, where I would suggest they would go would be in the OSPD provision.
As a design standard within that ordinance.
Yes,
Okay, thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Question, I'd like to get more information on these parallel plat requirements. I don't know if that's available or not.
We had one in our draft, but it was,
I'd like to get more of her input onto it.
well, yeah, absolutely.
That's just,
And that lays out the designs process, right? I mean, you come in and you say, here's what we traditionally would do and so forth.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think the one we had in our latest draft was a little confusing. Am I right?
I agree with you. The requirement and the concept is super simple. It was the way it was worded, and that's what kind of made me chuckle. It's like, the only reason I know what this is saying is because I know what it's supposed to be saying. So that's kind of funny. But it actually, I think, is the beauty. That's why I said I would recommend that approach. I think it's so beautifully easy to say, look, you're going to go in there. You wanted to go in there and plat it. Act like you're going to prepare your preliminary plat. And then show us that, and we'll review it. And that's where we'll tell you how we can confirm that that's your density for the project.
yeah, I just like to see some more examples, I guess. Good feel for it, right?
Yep. Patrick, two things?
Yeah, I raised my hand before because I thought we might be breaking into public comment.
Well, it's not really a hearing, so we're just gonna informally.
I mean, I've got a few things, I can take them one at a time, or I can just put them
A
in
couple.
one long
I
time.
personally have to jet here in a couple minutes for
Yeah, I'd
a
like to
family
too.
issue, but I can turn the gavel if it's on, but.
I realize after watching this, and looking back on what we've gone through over nearly 3 years now, really, in 3 iterations or so. I spent a lot of time arguing about things that were not really central to the issue, from my perspective or from the town's perspective, probably. Since I have a project of my own that I'd like to pursue, I can say for the record that I don't really need any particular incentive. I wanted the bonus density because we thought a few extra homes on this size lot would make for a better community, but it's not that essential. It's been a long time arguing about it, and I shouldn't have probably. Same thing with the parallel design stuff. I wanted to take that out of the draft. Not really a big deal, right? And now after seeing Rebecca's presentation, I realized why that's valuable. Actually. So that this presentation did a lot for me. The other thing that really did for me is the idea of removing roadblocks. Right? And if you want to make this an attractive option to people, this really gets close to my heart because I always see a lot of these roadblocks in front of me. I also think that the latest planning commission draft that was largely authored by Robert Fall has a lot of good things in it. And actually, if somebody could go through that line by line and say, well, which of these we represent roadblocks that are unnecessary or maybe counterproductive? We can take some things out, get a simpler ordinance actually, that's more effective. And I'm very keen on understanding where those roadblocks are. Things like the lot size and lot width, for example, are a great example of that. Some of the things are buried in different places, like the community water and septic systems. It's in a different place in the site condo ordinance, but it does present a roadblock that I think could be argued quite effectively is not needed. But that discussion has to take place. What exactly does that roadblock accomplish? It doesn't accomplish anything. It should be removed from that. The other things I wanted to say, as far as putting the private roads in there, interesting idea. I've made this comment individually to a few people that really needs to be passed by the township attorney. See if there are any issues from the township's perspective with that. We're in a different situation that Rebecca may not be aware of, where the county, well, I think you are now for this discussion, the county's not accepting any new public roads except in very narrow circumstances. You have a platted subdivision and you can't be a cul-de-sac and you have to have 2 entrances on the main road and blah, 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 blah. I went through all this stuff like all the county. So I know it's hard, right? So if you say to people across the township, people, developers, whatever, that you can't have any private roads and you just about can't have any public roads without going through huge hoops, is that a legal issue for the township? And is it okay though? I mean, if you open it up and say, okay, for an OSP, you can do it, is that sufficient to keep the township safe from a legal perspective? I don't have the answer to that. But I believe, based on what Paul said earlier, that there are some issues around that need to be better understood. What else?
One more big one.
Yeah, the first thing I thought about when you were talking about, Rebecca, you're talking about some places that have actually mandated that every development has to be an open space development. I don't think we're going to do that here.
No.
That was my first reaction was, I just feel like I'm against mandates in general, and I feel like my whole problem is that there's been too many restrictions put on what I can do. Right? And I wouldn't want to turn around and say, okay, well, now everybody has to develop my way. I'm doing the same thing, then, right? But if you have the right structure in place, this is something else I think Rebecca, you said several times, if you have the right structure in place to make it an attractive option, that's kind of a softer approach, and you're guiding things in the right direction without having to put the hammer down. Just remove the roadblocks and things will probably flow in the right direction. That's pretty much what I have to say.
Thanks, Patrick.
So you could start with the draft that you already have. And just,
Well, we'll take our cues from the board. I think you guys will probably get her review, or I think is that the process you're gonna use, Kurt or Sandy? You think you're gonna have her do the review and then go from there?
Yeah,
And that'll be helpful, because then we'll have an actual document to go from, and we can compare that to what we have. I mean, I think that's where I would start. But
actually, I did want to make another point that I forgot to write down.
Right.
This was kind of in response to what Kurt said about the lawyer's direction about the process for going through making revisions at this point. I believe that, I'm quite sure of this, that the lawyer objected to one thing that was being inserted after your draft,
Right.
and not the whole mass of everything else, because that one thing referred to a different ordinance section. That was out of bounds.
Yeah, no, I don't need to suggest the planning.
There is broad leeway.
The planning commission would go through a whole rigmarole, but we'd be more than happy to review and make, and look at her review and recommend that. We can do that in the meeting or two. So. All right, I do want to get things wrapped. Any other comments from folks? So we want to thank you, Rebecca. That was amazing, and we look forward to more from you.
And
Okay,
can we just clarify, Carol has the access to your slides that she can share with us?
yes, I forwarded this PowerPoint to her shortly before the meeting, so she should have it, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Any other communication or comments, concerns? Carol did text me about the next meeting in January. I think we are going to have a meeting. It's not going to be heavy duty, but we need a meeting to establish our officers. We need a meeting to do some housekeeping, and then the zoning map. The hope is maybe we can take a look at that in January. So with that, we get adjourned.
So, motion by
Motion by
Chuck,
Tom, seconded by myself. All in favor?
official time 8:10. 48.
8:48. There you go. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, we are adjourned. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Guys.
You know, there are, I think I talked to them about different products they could use. Yeah. Well, it's gonna be after we get it.
Yeah, looks like the speakers.
Well, I have, there's a built-in address, mic address system, so I don't know. So, yeah, we have to come meet Chewy.
Yeah, okay, how old is he? 8 weeks?
9, a little over 9, I think 9.
Okay, I'll be up.
Well, yeah, it'd be over 9, I think November 6th was his birthday.
Oh, okay.
You been traveling?
I have not yet. We were starting that, I got pulled back, and now it's kind of a high need, like if you have to go.
I'm getting stuck at the one city.
Oh, yeah, wonderful. Yeah, well, you get literally stuck up there. If you
Yeah.
at the right time.
One night. He's going at 60-mile-an-hour winds.
Oh, yeah. No, I just
know.
know.
Ice got that. Ice got the walls hard. Ice door.
Oh, yeah. Well, I gotta go take care of puppies so that
Oh,
Luke can get to bed.
oh, really? Oh,
It's hard to watch puppy Luke bath.
the whole process.
I'm gonna get a carrier and take it to Florida.
Well, that's under debate right now, whether he's going or not. We'll see.
Oh, you already know it.
I have a feeling he's going.
When you lose that battle. When you get done.
15th. Is that where we're going? Around the same point.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You
I'm going with them.
Are you flying a Legion?
Delta.
I'm going Delta.
I flew that one. Problem is right now, especially they're canceling like. Yeah. Their cancellation rates are huge. So if it was just me flying, that's fine, but not bringing the family and like.
Yeah.
You
Travel with a dog
Yeah,
too.
well, maybe. What's that?
So are you going with Dave or just going down to or to the office?
Yeah.
Are you really?
Just traffic. Come in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don?
Yes, sir. You're welcome.
You too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay. No?
Yeah.
No, sorry. No, you just need to- Oh. Oh.
North Carolina. We were there. Yeah.